Good afternoon. My name is Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, specializing in public opinion and electoral demography. And I'd like to begin by congratulating my former colleague and friend, Diana Furchtgott-Roth, on the publication of the second edition of Women's Figures, her new book. You're welcome. Diana is the former chief economist at the Department of Labor and a fellow today at the Manhattan Institute. I'd like also to welcome Ariane Hegewisch to AEI. Ariane, like Diana, is an economist by training and a study director at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Both women are steeped in economic data and have an impressive list of publications on familiar subjects such as the wage gap, occupational job segregation, and policy initiatives regarding women. I think we can all look forward to a very substantive discussion of what's at stake for working women in the 2012 election. In 42 days, Election Day voting will begin, and more women will be voting than men. In 2008, the electorate was 53% female, and about 8 million more women voted than men. The polls tell us that men and women will be voting on their impressions of the economy and the job situation and how both candidates would handle these going forward. Virtually every poll shows that the economy and jobs are the top issues for both sexes, with health care a distant third. Almost every poll shows that only small numbers of men and women say that they're better off than they were 4 years ago. Most say that they're doing about the same. Men and women are reacting very differently to the candidates, and the candidates themselves seem to be living in alternative economic realities. Women aren't a monolithic voting bloc, of course, but in almost all polls, women prefer President Obama by large margins, and men prefer Governor Romney by narrow ones. We're going to begin with 2 short 7-minute presentations about what's at stake. And I think it would be helpful if both of you could give us your assessment of the past 4 years to set the stage for where we are today and to go forward. Then I'd like to ask each of them a question or two, and then we're going to turn it over to you in the audience. Diana will go first, followed by Ariane. Diana.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I know you have a lot better things to do this lunchtime, although the free lunch at AEI is the best. I recall very fondly the years I spent here from 1993 to 2001 as assistant to Christum Youth and then as a resident fellow, where the first edition of Women's Figures was published. And this was the longest time I've had in any job in my whole life, 8 years. So I have many, many fond memories, including the terrific cafeteria and lunches. So I wrote the first edition of this book back in the late 1990s. Someone called Barbara Ladine came and said to me, Diana, you should write a book about the myths of the wage gap and the glass ceiling and pink-collar jobs. And I said, really, Barbara, no one believes in the wage gap. There's no point in writing such a book. Everybody knows that men and women in the same jobs are paid about the same when you account for their experience and time in the workplace and education. And she said, no, Diane, you should really write the book and put down the data on women's progress and also poverty, because it's not all good things. So I did, and it was a big success. And I've written many books, but I'm still known as the author of Women's Figures, possibly because it's such a great title, which Barbara Ladine also picked. So the second edition has just come out, and I want to thank AEI for publishing it. What's interesting about men and women is that if there were, for example, a Martian who would come down to Earth, and this Martian would see 2 groups of people, let's call them men and women, and one group had 58% of all BAs and MAs awarded, and over half of PhDs, and a 5-year longer life expectancy, and fewer on drugs, and fewer in jail. And then this Martian heard that, oh, this is the group where there's the war on women. This is the group that needs affirmative action. This Martian would be amazed. The Martian would say, no, it's men that need help. They're the ones with the higher unemployment rate, the people in jail, on drugs. They're the ones who are having trouble graduating from high school, graduating from college. But the way it works is that women are regarded as the group of victims in need of help. And one reason for this is the story of the wage gap between men and women. And we hear President Obama saying women make 77 cents on a man's dollar. And we hear it repeated in discussions about the Paycheck Fairness Act. Politicians are asked, how can you not be in favor of the Paycheck Fairness Act because women only make 77 cents on a man's dollar? Well, this number itself, technically speaking, is accurate, but it compares all full-time women with all full-time men. And men and women, for various reasons, make different choices about education when they're in college, about jobs after they graduate from college, and about hours of work once they are in this job. And so that combination means that on average they earn less than men do. But it doesn't mean that they're discriminated against, nor is it a social problem. Just like it isn't a social problem if a man retires early or a male doctor, as used to be the case, would take afternoons off to play golf on Wednesdays, for example. That's not a social problem either. It's just someone choosing more time for themselves over more money. Well, let's look at education first of all. Men tend to predominantly major in sciences, computer science, math, chemistry, physics, whereas more women than men major in communications, literature, and women's studies also, which are lead to lower paying jobs afterwards. Once they graduate, you find that more women tend to go into the nonprofit sector, more tend to go into education and health services, more go into professional services. Men become scientists. Men with less education have dirty, dangerous jobs that pay more because they are more dirty and dangerous. And interestingly enough, the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, last week published lists of fatalities per occupation, and the top 8 were male, and the ones with lower fatalities tended to be women. So fishermen, for example, have 121 fatal injuries per 100,000. Loggers, 102. Aircraft pilots, 57. Trash collectors, roofers, structural iron and steel workers, farmers and ranchers, those are all male-dominated, dirty, dangerous jobs, and as a result, people need to be paid more to do them. In contrast, education and health services, 8/10, less than 1 injury per 100,000. Financial activities, 1.1. Retail trade, 1.9. So the jobs women choose might be less well-paying than some of the jobs men choose, but they come with a more pleasant work environment. Then if you look at the hours that men and women work about 80 or 90% of the hours of men. This is full-time women. Full-time women work less than full-time men. About 25% of women historically have worked full-time. And so when you compare full-time, there's different numbers of hours. When you look at men and women in comparable jobs, and you look at them on an hourly basis, you find that men and women make about the same. Maybe 95 cents on a dollar is what most studies come up with. And economists use regression analysis so that they can look at age, experience, time out of the workforce, type of job, and only by doing that can you really disentangle the true wage gap between men and women. Taking averages doesn't do it. But even when you take some averages, say you look at single men versus single women in urban areas, as Mark Perry of AEI has very nicely assembled this data on his blog, Carpe Diem, which I highly recommend to all of you, you find that women earn more. So there are groups of women that do earn more than groups of men. So the only correct way of looking at it is to take men and women in comparable jobs, first-year cashiers at supermarkets, one male and one female. How much do they make? First-year associates at law firms, one male and one female, and compare their wages. So you do find that men's and women's wages tend to diverge as they go on in the workforce, and that's very much correlated with numbers of children. Marriage and children make men earn more. Marriage and children tend to result in women earning less as they choose more flexible careers and they choose time to spend at home with their children. And if you want an indication of why this is a choice and not discrimination, as my opponent here might say, take a look at the website of Yale Law School women. They have a website. These are some of the smartest, brightest young women in the country if they've managed to get into Yale Law School. I certainly couldn't have done it myself. And they give awards for the 10 best companies to work for. And you might think these best companies would be the ones where women can make the most or work the most hours. No, these companies tend to be the ones with flexible schedules. Already, before these women have entered the workforce, they're looking for flexible schedules so they can combine work and family. And those firms with flexible schedules are the ones that are given awards by Yale Law women. And already it's just unfortunate that flexible jobs pay less than inflexible jobs when you have to be at the beck and call of an employer and you have to be ready to travel at a moment's notice and pick up and go for a week in Ames, Iowa, or San Francisco, or Dallas. You have to get paid more to do that. So how does this relate to the election, as Carolyn asked? Well, these having preferences for women, affirmative action for women, the Paycheck Fairness Act, burdens employers with additional costs and makes fewer employers, fewer businesses want to locate in the United States. We already have a system of laws where if women are discriminated against, they can sue, and sometimes they win, and sometimes they don't win. What we don't need is additional regulations, because that slows our economy. Just today we heard that GDP growth rate in the second quarter was 1.3%, down from 2% in the first quarter. And average economic growth historically, when we're not in a recession, is about 2.73%. We are well below the growth that we need to produce jobs. Women need jobs to progress up in the workforce. And women also want jobs for their families and their friends. The way for more women's economic progress is additional jobs. It's not more regulations. And with that, Carolyn's told me my time is up, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to AEI for arranging this event. Clearly, we are both here because we come at this from slightly different directions. But before I start, I would like to say, I looked at the book, and it's a wonderful collection of facts. I felt right at home in it. We clearly do not agree on a lot of the interpretation of these, and we probably also don't agree on, particularly on the role for public policy in doing something about some of these facts, but I do think it's a very nice compilation.
Well, thank you very much.
So in terms of our task to think about the policy proposals that might be on the cards from a Romney presidency or an Obama presidency, and how they might benefit or not women. What do working women want or need, which I think on a lot of issues isn't that different from working men. The first issue, as Diana ended with, probably is jobs, an ability to make enough money to support your family and yourself, and jobs for yourself and your loved ones, your kids and your husband. Second one is to be treated fairly at work and to be able to advance at work and through your working life. And I guess the third one I want to highlight would be to have supports at work that allow you to be both a good worker and a good parent or a good daughter if you have parents that need care. So let's go to the job one, or back to the job one. The women's jobs over the last 2 years, women's recovery of jobs, of the jobs lost during the recession, have been lagging behind the jobs men have gained back, if you look at all the jobs that were lost, primarily because of budget constraints and budget cuts in local and state government. And as we know, women are more likely to work in public services, and hence job cuts tend to affect them more. But those type of budget cuts also cut or reduce the supports that allow women to be at work: childcare, workforce development, good schools, the things that make you feel confident that your kids are looked after, and that help you to get education and not end up in debt. And we probably both agree that it is a greater priority of the Obama administration to kind of invest in public services than it would be in the for the Romney administration. Secondly, to be treated fairly at work. I completely agree with Diana that direct discrimination at work for men and women who do the same job is only a minor component of closing the gender wage gap, although it remains an issue. The fact that women and men do different jobs and that the jobs women do get paid less is a big factor, as is the issue of not being recruited or promoted at the same rates. And of course, the other issue of women having more disrupted working lives than men because they tend to have more responsibility or take more responsibility for kids and looking after elderly relatives. Now, but to go back to what is on the books in terms of existing laws and what is proposed, the Paycheck Fairness Act, I do feel it does make a difference and that we haven't solved the problem yet. The Paycheck Fairness Act, which President Obama supports and President Romney hasn't kind of said whether he does or he doesn't, would do two things. It would make it illegal to retaliate against people for discussing their wages with their colleagues. At the moment, you can be fired for it, and about 50% of workers say that they are contractually barred from discussing their wages or are strongly discouraged. And the second issue is it encourages more data collection on pay. So it's actually not a huge kind of amendment to what we have at the moment. Now, because of pay secrecy and because data on pay is not collected in establishments, so we actually don't know whether women doing the same job as men earn as much in the same firm, but we have to rely on law cases. And I don't think law cases are a very good source, but they're a source we have. If you look at the Walmart case, which just was re-entered into court in California, and I should say you might have heard that at the Supreme Court the case was lost, but this was about the way the class action was framed. There wasn't a discussion of the basic discrimination facts underneath. I would recommend to anybody who thinks there isn't discrimination anymore to read the sworn statements from the plaintiffs in there. There was blatant discrimination, women not being allowed to compete on the same basis as men for promotions to management and supervisory positions, and also having, the female departments, cosmetics, paying less than the male departments, camera, and women not being allowed to be supervisors in camera departments. So lots of little facts which reduced their earnings and meant there was a lot of discrimination and frustration there. Another case, Novartis, a big pharmaceutical company, which was a case mainly discrimination against women who took maternity leave and then had their pay reduced quite a lot. But the bit I want to highlight is that turned out that when you compared the top female performers in terms of sales, these were sales staff, to the top male performers, the female performers systematically got lower bonuses than the male ones. And the way it came out was only because a top female performer was married to a top male performer. So they could discuss their wages without fearing being fired. And I don't think it's necessary, that this is necessary bad intent. I don't know how much, I hope you allow me to tell a story. When I talk about equal pay on the radio, often friends tell me stories, and this is from a friend of mine who works for the federal government, and she and a male colleague were kind of filling in the summer for their boss. And after the summer, the boss came and said, you both did this really well, and I think you should get a kind of bonus to acknowledge that. And he wrote a memo, and he showed her the memo, and thank you, this is okay. And in the memo, there was a higher share for her male colleague than for her. And he said, I'm sure, I hope you think that's all right. He's looking after his family. And she said, oh yeah, of course. And then afterwards she thought, why did I say that? Actually, I'm the main breadwinner in my family. My husband, I've got 2 kids. My husband is an artist, so his earnings are a little less regular, and he actually takes care of the kids. And I'm in the same position as this guy. And there isn't that much research because we don't have that much in-company research. But what there is suggests when there are these subjective decisions, often the assumption is men need more than women. And unless there's accountability and transparency, it's very hard to challenge or unearth these assumptions. And I'm sure that manager really meant well, and he didn't think he was discriminating, but he did discriminate. Finally, on this one, I think it's also important, and the Obama administration has prioritized this, to enforce existing wage and hour laws and minimum wage laws, overtime laws, and the research suggests, and this is women at the bottom and men at the bottom of the labor market who really do not earn a lot, that there is quite a systematic underpayment, for example, tip minimum wage, that wages aren't made up when they should be made up. You probably know people who work as waiters and waitresses in restaurants are only entitled to $2.13 as a minimum wage, and manicurists and so on. So tips are important on that, and they need to be made up. They often aren't. Overtime pay often isn't enforced, and hours shift around. You have the kind of flexibility, and actually, Diana, there I really disagree with you. That type of flexibility where one week you expected to work 48 hours, another week you're expected to work 13 hours. You don't know from day to day how many hours you work. You kind of start at noon, and then it's until end of business in restaurants, which can be 2 o'clock, or can be 6 o'clock, or can be midnight. And actually those people earn the least wages. It doesn't give you, there is no, this issue that flexibility pays more does not come out, pays less. That flexibility is a reason for lower earnings. That it does not come out of the regression analysis. And men typically have more flexibility in terms of saying, I can work here or there, or can work, they have to work long hours, and a lot of women too. But the flexibility to take off some time to have control over their hours, men have more than women. Okay. So finally, very quickly, women and men need supports at work that allow them to be good workers. First one, very basic, maternity leave. You probably know that the US is one of only 4 countries in the world without a statutory right to paid maternity leave. And the other countries are small and poor countries. The Family and Medical Leave Act only covers about 60% of workers. The US has one of the highest rates of infant and maternal mortality rates and poor health for mothers. I mean, that's so basic. You can hear I'm European, so for me this was quite shocking, but I still think it is a basic requirement. And it also, all the evidence suggests that women who have access to paid job-protected maternity leave have better wage advancement and better wage progression, and it does make an impact on closing the gender wage gap. Another one, very basic, paid sick days to be able to go to prenatal care, or to take your child to get inoculations, vaccinated, so that they can go to school. Very important, 50% of people working in the private sector in the US do not have the right to paid sick days, any, and they can be fired if they are sick. And they are fired, and you get fired more at the bottom of the labor market, the kind of people who get pulled into job turnover and never manage to get a leg up. And then finally, as I already mentioned, you need working hours, flexibility that helps you to be a good person and to survive, which means for people at the bottom of the labor market often means a right to regular and predictable working hours. But also sometimes to be able to take some time off to go to the school meeting and then work longer on other hours. It works out for different types of jobs in different ways, but it is an issue for everybody. So in summary, I totally agree that women have advanced enormously during the last few decades, and they have advanced in education and by being able to look after themselves and progress in the workplace, but there are a lot of gaps which need filling. And I guess where we differ the most, I feel that public policy plays an important role in filling those or supporting those gaps, providing supports for those, and that public policy overall supports economic growth and development if it's focused on these issues rather than hindering economic development.
Thank you very much, Ariane and Diana. I wonder if you'd like to begin, Diana, by responding to Ariane, and then Ariane just responding to any points that Diana may make, and then I'll ask a question of my own.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for your remarks, Ariane, and also for your nice comments about my book. There's so much of what Ariane has said, and I can't possibly respond to all of it, but just a few small points. The Paycheck Fairness Act didn't pass under a Democratic Senate with 60 senators, a Democratic House of Representatives, and a Democratic president, just in the first year of President Obama's term. Why is it? It's because what Ariane hasn't mentioned is that there are associated costs to this. There are costs to employers of reporting all the data. There's costs of doing the paperwork, of making sure that they're complying with the laws, and that makes America a less friendly place to do business. All the policy proposals that Ariane mentioned, paid maternity leave, access, paid sick days, working hours, flexibility, these all cost money, and it's interesting that Ariane hasn't said anything about the costs of these. And taxes in Europe, where these policies are in effect, are much higher in order to pay for this. The top income tax rate is around 50 or sometimes 60%. On top of that, there's a value-added tax. Value-added taxes range from 15 to 22%. So these things cost money, and the higher taxes slow the economy. And higher taxes can also discourage women from going into the labor force because they are a second earner. And if a lot of your income gets taken away in taxes, then you don't want to go into the workforce as much. It's not worth it.
Ariane, your response?
Yeah. Costs. So firstly, on the Paycheck Fairness Act, I think there is something to be said. If something is wrong and illegal, we don't say, okay, your bike gets stolen, tough, we're not investigating it because it costs too much to have a policeman. And I think paycheck fairness, we know it's illegal to pay a woman less than a man, or to pay two people differently who do the same job, and to say we're not going to enforce it because it's too costly, I think is a strange argument. However, the other issue is there's substantial amount of research that people, if they feel they get paid less than they should be paid, or they get treated unfairly, not promoted, not recruited to a job, that they have lower productivity. And there's also polling evidence, and maybe all these women are mistaken, and I think transparency might help to address this, to show that women feel they are often not treated fairly at work. So I think that issue on the cost, the administration against the productivity impact is one we don't know, but I don't think it's as clear-cut as you set out.
Well, everybody knows, just to respond, everybody knows that paying two people who do the same job differently is illegal. And you cited these lawsuits that are now going through. And we have many, many laws to deal with them. We have the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Pay Act. We just had the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act that was passed. So when women are paid differently, they can sue. And they do sue, and these things are worked out in court. What I'm saying is there is not systematic discrimination against women that requires the kind of major transformation that Ariane is proposing. And what we have is equal pay. Right now, we have equal pay for equal work. Under the Paycheck Fairness Act, employers would report groups of men, groups of women. They would have to be paid the same, but the men and the women aren't necessarily doing the same work. So if you look at a large company such as Exxon, would it have to pay its administrative assistants the same as it pays its oil drillers? When oil drilling, these two jobs might require the same education, but oil drilling is a much more dirty, dangerous job than being an administrative assistant. And so it's these kinds of questions that would arise.
Your response, Ariane?
I wish the Paycheck Fairness Act would allow that kind of comparable worth comparison, but I think that it's unlikely that it would. However, and I think having comparable worth would be a much more dramatic intervention, but it's not on the books.
But wouldn't the government have to, wouldn't firms have to report to the government pay by race and sex and occupation within the firm?
There are already a lot of companies, all the companies who are federal contractors, which is about 25% of the workforce, already do that.
Exactly. And
And
the
they
Paycheck
don't-
Fairness Act would make all of them do that, right?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, I might wish it would, but actually all it does, it says it would make it illegal to retaliate against somebody who would discuss their pay, because at the moment you can't, you might get fired for saying, okay, Lilly Ledbetter basically only found out 18 years after she started work in the Michelin tire company, or Goodyear tire company, that she was paid less because there was a policy saying you are not allowed to discuss it, and she still is not saying who gave her that information, because that person could be fired. What kind of law is it where you can get fired for making use of your legal right? But I just wanted to add something else on flexible working, because again, there is no evidence that it imposes major burden. We have a number of countries, and the country where I lived most of my life, the United Kingdom, actually has tax rates which aren't much higher than here, or I think actually on some of it lower, but they have a comprehensive right to request flexible working, right? Which doesn't solve
They have a
all
top tax
problems.
rate of 45%,
And here it's
39.6.
Yeah, so it doesn't really make a huge difference, and the same amount of people pay it or don't pay it. A lot of people in the lower rates don't pay it. But flexible working, let's get back to flexible working, because you said it
But there is a
imposes-
difference between 39.6 and 45.
There is, but I don't think it makes that much difference to where companies locate, or that it may, whatever. The tax rate, what I wanted to discuss is flexible working, because you said that it imposes a lot of costs on companies, and that it stops companies from wanting to locate where there are greater flexible working rights. In the UK and in several other European countries, but in the UK, there's a right to request flexible working. It's a pretty weak law, because all your employer has to do is to hear your proposal and consider it properly, to tell you, no, you cannot work these hours because, in the hours where I need you is where all the customers come, and you want to work in the evening where nobody's here, you can't do it. But they have to give a considered response. And initially it applied just to parents of children under school age, and now it covers also people who care for elderly adults, and for, everybody with kids under 16, I think. And what is found, and study after study actually shows, when you have well-designed flexible working, there is no cost. There actually is a benefit to employers. At worst, it's cost neutral. And what it does to the economy is keep people in the labor market who you would otherwise lose, well-qualified people who might work, somebody who does have the degree that you mentioned, who went to college for 4 years, might have a master's degree, has a child, and finds that the hours just don't match, and chooses to work at as a cashier in a retail store. That might be fine for that woman for those years, although in future years she will have less pension income, and she will have less money in the short term to support her kids. But for the economy, it's a loss. If you as an economy invest, and companies do support education, if you invest in somebody to go to college for 4 or 5 years, and then they work as a supermarket cashier, that's a loss to the economy. And so both within companies and in the economy as a whole, there is no evidence that having good flexible working policies is a drain on the economy. At least no evidence I've ever come across. So, certainly right.
So Britain has changed its policy, so employers now have to justify not giving flexible time. If an employee requests it, they have to grant it unless they can give a good reason otherwise. And so Ariane is saying this doesn't affect the operations of the firm, and there isn't a study that shows that. Look, this is just laughable. It's absolutely laughable that here an employer has to grant flexible time, and it doesn't make any difference to its cost structure. It is just not believable. It doesn't keep people in the labor market. It makes the cost of employment higher. When the cost of employment is higher, businesses hire fewer workers, and it keeps them out of the labor market. The choice isn't between a flexible job sometimes and an inflexible job other times. Sometimes it's a choice between no job at all. And with the raise in the minimum wage that we've seen since 2007, we see that the unemployment rate for low-skilled workers has gone up. We see all these substitutions between capital and labor at the low end. You see these food trucks that are lining the street. These food trucks are there so that restaurants avoid paying the cost of waiters. You are doing the waiter's job by you are waiting in line. You are literally the waiter. You wait in line and you get your food. If you look at CVS, it has these scanning machines now instead of having cashiers. Again, that's substitution of capital for labor. If you go online often, you have to fill in the form instead of having someone on the telephone. to fill in the forms for you. There are more and more automated systems rather than individuals. What happens is that firms do away with the low-priced labor if there are too many strings attached. So what we need to do is I would say, and when I was talking about flexibility, what I was saying is that women often chose more flexible jobs, of which there are many, many in the economy. One reason women have traditionally gone into teaching is because it allows them time to look after their families afterwards and the summers off. There are plenty of jobs that are flexible, such as nursing.
This has been a very fascinating discussion, and I think we could go on for quite a while, but we only have 15 minutes, and so I want to turn to some of your questions. And I think we should have microphones in the room, and if you could identify yourselves, if you have a question. There's a question over here. Just identify yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Samantha Schroeder, and I'm reporting for the Daily Caller. I have a question regarding the solid economic benefits or problems with women who take 1 to 2 years off for maternity leave versus what I hear a lot of American women doing, taking 4 to 6 weeks off. There's many studies show that is actually very detrimental to the quality of life for not just the child, but for the mother-child relationship. What can you tell me about the economic effects? Like, is there a dramatically higher likelihood for a woman that takes 6 weeks off from maternity leave to get back into the workforce and to keep going versus 1 to 2 years?
Yeah, the shorter the time you take off from the labor force, the less you fall behind in terms of earnings.
The women who take 3 to 5 weeks off are often the women who are in the worst type of jobs. And
Hey,
so
I took 5 weeks off.
Right,
All right, good job.
often, not everybody, but if you look at it statistically, it is true. If you look at the facts in the book, so you get different types of labor markets basically, and it depends whether you know, people say, I mean, the pediatric advice and the health advice at the moment is for women to take off a year for a child, which seems to me rather long, to tell you the truth. But, you know, something women take, if they can, they take 12 weeks or so, 6 to 12 weeks for health reasons, and it's good for the baby. If you go back after 6 weeks, actually what the research suggests, the key issue is whether you have job protected leave. And so whether that leave in terms of advancement is 6 weeks or 12 weeks or 6 months, if you can go back to the same employer and there's a set time, people will go back to that same employer and they do better afterwards. So what really matters, while I'm thinking while talking, what really matters really is not how much time you take off in some level, but whether you can go back and whether you're encouraged to go back. Apart from that, in international research suggests, you know, if you take more than 6 to 9 months per child, it does have a bad impact on long-term career progression and also macroeconomically.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you.
At Voice of a Moderate. I have a question. A company I was researching, the internal statistics show that women in management went from 20.9% in 2006 to 10%. Now, I really would not have a problem except they take money from the federal government. Now, it's dramatic reduction in women in management. And do you have any comments about when there is a dramatic change going from 2006 to 2009?
You're saying that the share of women, of managers who were female dropped from 29 to 10?
20.9% to 10%.
So it halved.
Yes.
You know, I think it's very hard to respond to one example without knowing what the reasons are. So it could be, I mean, a lot of the different fate of men and women in the labor market during the last few years was explained by the fact that men and women often do different work. So it could be that the women were in part of the company which was more economically exposed, And it could be that it was women were more junior than men and therefore were let go more, and it could be discrimination. So it is really, what I think the only thing I would ask for in terms of oversight and accountability is to make sure that, the decisions are not tainted by thinking, okay, the women, they're married and they can go home and the husbands are the breadwinner. But just looking at those figures, it's very hard to know what's behind them.
Yeah, plus it's important that companies hire the best people in their managerial slots. They shouldn't think they have to hire a certain number of women or a certain number of men. They are responsible for their shareholders. Their job is to make profits, not to hire any particular group, such as Hispanics, men, women, black, white. I'd also like to say about the 6 months maternity leave, again, and Ariane proposed paid maternity leave. So I assume you're talking about 6 months paid maternity leave.
Well, do you know FMLA, paid FMLA is fine by me.
So that would be 3 months.
That's 12 weeks, yeah.
12 weeks. So again, that's a cost to the employer. That means hiring women is more costly. And companies would hire fewer women rather than more. It does not help women to have these strings attached, these additional costs attached to their hiring. And one more point, it is not true that someone can be fired for talking about their salary with a co-worker. I checked with Howard Radsley, former solicitor of the Labor Department. If you are in a company and you talk about your salary with someone else and reveal what your salary is, that is not grounds for firing.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a research assistant here at AEI. So just a point first, I'd be interested to see on that list of the dirty and dangerous jobs, if we were to conceive of motherhood as a job, where it would fall. I think it'd be up there. But secondly, my question actually isn't about that. It's about how technology affects women sort of in the labor market. In my mind, I see ways it could help and hurt us, and I'd be curious to see sort of where you think it's going. On one hand, you have the substitution of capital for labor that you talked about. It kind of eliminates the need for jobs that employ a lot of women at the lower levels, i.e. waitressing with the food trucks. On the other hand, I know it makes things like telecommuting easier. And now, there have been some articles about how more women are doing things like blogging, setting up their own internet sites, allowing them to exist outside of the conventional corporate structure entirely. So in that way, it's progressive. I'd just be interested to know sort of what your perspectives are on where.
If I could add to that, I think all of us know that Hannah Rosen has a new book out called, I think it's The End of Men, and she's arguing, of course, that women are soaring past men in many areas, educational attainment, management positions, and the like. And I was also wondering about this new post-industrial economy that she sees, whether you both see that it's going to be a lot better for women, and which political candidate, which presidential candidate is best suited to take advantage of that.
So first, as to your comment as to motherhood, caregivers, paid caregivers have low rates of fatalities. So that's not regarded as a dangerous job.
For childbirth, though, and we mentioned in the debate, right, that the RO rates in the U.S. are high. It's beside the point.
And as for technology, technology is of great help to women in setting up businesses and to men also. It's a great help to entrepreneurs, so it can really help women combine work and family, and we've seen a lot of women-run firms. And I think that Romney, to ask you the second part of the question, if you look at Obama and Romney, I think whichever of them does the least regulation of the internet will be doing women the most favors.
Firstly, on technology, I think what technology is doing, it is increasingly taking away the kind of heavy lifting stuff out of jobs. And so the issue only men can do that is becoming much less important. On the telecommuting, I think it opens a lot of doors for men and women. However, this issue of you have to now be on your BlackBerry 24/7 also imposes constraints, and we're not quite sure yet how to deal with that. But I think also in terms of job saving through technology, actually manufacturing was hit by that more probably than retail jobs. And one of the problems for almost for the sectors that women work in more than men, care, childcare, healthcare. You can't do that much with technology, and hence it is harder, if in a perfect world where we share productivity gains, to get up wages to a decent level. So, you know, for me, I think that means childcare is a social good, so it means you need some public supports. Diana probably doesn't agree with that. But I think technology is not affecting all sectors equally, and that has a bearing on earnings differentials and, you know, how we service those needs.
Two questions, one here in the front and then on this side over here.
Hi, Maddie Duppler with Americans for Tax Reform. I am just, the conflict that for me I think hasn't been explained away is that we're talking about the cost of companies, we're talking about the cost of a lot of different initiatives, and Diana mentioned how the regulatory costs really have a huge burden on the private market and private sector. And if the goal is to, you know, keep women in the labor force, increase the number of women in the labor force, you mentioned how cuts to government, you know, budget problems really lead to a decrease in women in the labor force because they are disproportionately a part of government and have government jobs. I would argue that, you know, you also talk about the social services, how this discredits or keeps women out of the labor force because the costs in these programs are cut. I would argue that this is something, it goes bigger than just the cost itself. It's a size of government issue and what we're doing to keep women in the labor force. And if we've seen that, you know, the struggling economy, a bigger government that continues to squeeze the public sector doesn't seem to be the answer. Don't we need to be talking about policies that increase women in the private sector? And I think that if this discussion is about Obama versus Romney, who's going to be better for that kind of climate, you know, we already know what Obama wants to do to keep women out of the labor force. He wants to start taxing their businesses more. You know, Obamacare has 21 different tax hikes that's going to affect businesses, a lot of them disproportionately on women. You know, the excise tax, the first excise tax that went into effect with healthcare. I'm sorry. You know, was on tanning salons, which are disproportionately owned by women. So my question for you is that if the problem that we have right now, where we've seen more government to address the answer, hasn't fixed it, why should the answer be more government still?
And let's put this question on the table too, and then we can have both of you answer them because we have only a few minutes, sadly.
Olive Hopkins, retired. Somebody told me that in one European country, the government increases the pension for women who have had a certain number of children. You get an increase in your pension for every child that you have. Is this true? And wouldn't this solve some of the problems of women not being compensated for taking time off to have children if they got an increase in their pension later on?
Well, it's an interesting idea. It's possible Russia does that. I know that they give awards to women who have many children, and I see. Yes. Well, it is possible that I think, in terms of the amount of money, it probably wouldn't make that much difference because the amount of money is what you're facing right now by stopping work. And I think people don't think that far out. They need the money now rather than when they retire. And it's possible that the French system of having more cash bonuses up front, or the British system of having more benefits up front. Apparently France has been very successful and it has the highest fertility rate in Europe. And as to why would more government help? If you like what public schools are doing to the children, then yes, you would want to extend that to childcare and back to day one. But as you've seen from the Chicago teachers' strike, many people want to opt out of the public school system. And I would say that we've tried trillion-dollar stimulus programs. That hasn't worked, and we need to take a different tack.
Well,
but then my opponent, of course, will give the other view.
Yes, I will. So I think government isn't the solution, but I think you need a basic, well-run government sector. You need good education, and you know, money isn't everything, but money is something in good education. You need childcare. You need some university subsidized higher education. You need workforce counseling and workforce advice to make the private sector as successful as possible. So I don't think it's an either-or. They're complements, and in fact, I think, you know, the stimulus package has stopped. it didn't partly, the economy is where it is because what's going on in my home country and in Germany and you know, in Europe overall, so it's not just all here. So anyway, on government, I think it's,
Right.
you know, but on the, there are a number of European countries who in some way provide pension credits for women with children. And we recently did a report on this, if anybody's interested. There are some, for example, I think Italy had this, and Greece, you know, had this system. If you had 4 kids, then you could retire at 50 if you were a woman. And those type of policies, I think, they kind of say women should be good mothers, and we support them to be good mothers. And I would prefer policies which kind of treat women and men more equally. You make sure that if you look after a child, you don't get hurt in the in pensions, but that they also encouragements to go back to work. And the Swedish system has a lot of that. So, you know, you can work part-time for sometimes, get credit, but then if you don't go back to work, you know, you actually lose pension, which they say people need to work, so to support our social system to some extent, and they set encouragement, which also is with taxes. I think taxes play a huge role in giving incentives to men and women to work, and they're often set up so that they can give disincentives.
We have time for one final question.
But if I could just make one comment. We don't want to model ourselves on Europe. We can see Europe is falling apart. We can see the riots there in Spain and in Greece and the terrible financial situation of these countries. And I agree with Ariane that we need education, we need childcare. We are in complete agreement on these. My view is that they should be privately provided, and Ariane's view is they should be government provided. I think there will be a higher quality of all these things if they are provided through the private sector, with individuals having their own tax money back to purchase them.
We have time for one last question, right back here.
Hi, I'm Melissa Pollack. I'm a retired government employee. About 10 or 15 years after I joined the workforce, I know the statistic was like 58%. In other words, women made 58 cents for every dollar earned by men. And now the statistic is up to, I think you said 73 cents.
77.
People say 77 or 78.
Okay.
If you, depending on how you measure it, it can get up into the 80s or even over $1.
Okay. What I'm suggesting is that if that statistic is continuing to close over the years, which it seems to be doing, then we probably don't have anything to worry about. But my question is it stuck? If it's stuck, then I would say it is cause for concern. Yeah. So I think people tend to focus on that number, that absolute number, and don't look at change over time. Yeah. And I'd like to know if there has been change in recent years.
Ariane, I think you wrote in one of your papers that it would take 45 years for it to finally close, but we have been making progress.
Right, and it has been stuck pretty much in the last decade. So.
But I don't think that we're ever going to expect it to be one-to-one unless girls in school and women in college choose the same fields as men do to study, and until they choose the same hours of work. And we continually see women choosing fewer hours of work and wanting more flexible jobs so they can combine children and their work, and I don't see that that is going to ever completely change.
I think the issue always with choice, when you're an economist at least, is whether it's free choice or constrained choice. And often the constraints on choice give you much better idea whether what the outcome is optimal or not. And I'm just not convinced that the situation we have at the moment between men and women and work is all due to free choice. I think there are lots of constraints, both in terms of information and in terms of support services, which mean that right now we really don't know whether there is free choice or not.
Well, I think women are rational, we are smart, we make the right choices on the basis of information. We're not victims pushed into different kinds of career and work choices.
I want to thank both Ariane and Diane for a very, very thoughtful, illuminating, and civil discussion, and we will see you in 42 days.
For about 5 years or so.
Thank you very, very much, Ariane and Diana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for moderating.
Ich bin hier mit dem Europäischen